Well, hello everyone to this webinar in our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. As I said, we'll keep it short to just 30 minutes today. It's all about future thinking, embracing uncertain futures, or should I say extremely uncertain futures. Today, our guest speaker is Phil Tate, my colleague. He's a trained futurist, one of just a handful in New Zealand. He'll provide an overview of foresighting tools, which can all be useful to plan for uncertain futures. We will only have a chance to really provide a very short overview of those tools in this webinar, but hopefully you will find something that could be useful for you. And we're hoping to also go into a bit more of an in-depth online workshop for at least one of the tools. And with that, over to you, Phil.
Good afternoon, everybody. Phil Tate speaking here. This afternoon, particularly given the current context of the world, I'd suggested to Barbara that we maybe could have a look at a few tools which help us to think about the future, because clearly in thinking about the future, that really influences our actions today. And I'm sure many of you at the moment are in war rooms and various sort of scrambles to try and figure out quite what is happening at the moment, and you might be looking for some opportunity then to get your head around some tools that help you maybe put some structure to this. So I'm going to take you through a few tools. Some are more complex than others, and hopefully some are pretty simple that you could literally do on the back of a fact packet almost, and to help you sort of figure things out a bit. So without further ado, I'm going to go through the first of these, which is using 3 horizons, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a really good tool to bring people together, to bring different perspectives together and move away from sort of rigid mindsets. So if we look at this, we've got effectively what might be termed strategic fit on the side there, on the left-hand axis, and over time on the bottom axis there as well. So strategic fit, sometimes called prevalence, you know, the things that are or are not working. And you could say that at the moment, we're in horizon 1, and we kind of appreciate that things are sort of dropping off. If you're thinking about a normal, in the normal world, you might be thinking about a product life cycle. In the current world, we could be talking about the entire global system itself in terms of that first horizon. Anyway, we also, though, are aware that there's a horizon 3, so that effectively is what's starting to emerge. We can't necessarily say what that is at this stage, but we've got a feeling that stuff is happening. And in the middle, we've got this horizon 2 in the middle, which is this very turbulent zone, which is around stuff that we're trying, stuff that people are shaping. So you can think of that just both as sort of, you might say, waves of change, but also different mindsets, because the first of those horizons is very much the managerial mindset, how we're trying to manage the operations of today. And horizon 2 would be your entrepreneurial mindset, which is very much around people trying different things to move things forward. And horizon 3, you could say, is a visionary mindset. Now, those kind of perspectives or mindsets may reside in different people within the organization, but they, I think, also reside within ourselves as well. So we have to try and make sense of this sort of very turbulent change and bring that conversation together. So how do we do that? The easiest way, effectively, and this is a relatively simple process, is to ask a series of 5 questions. And in doing so, sort of elicit what it is that we are both seeing at the moment in the world, but also what it is, the world that we're trying to seek to change as well. So the first of those questions would be over in horizon 1. What evidence indicates the current system is under pressure to address emerging conditions or is even failing? Clearly, you can apply that in a global context, but obviously you can apply that both, you can apply this even at an individual level, but certainly at an organizational level too. What are the things that are indicating you're under pressure right now? What are the challenges that you're currently experiencing? And the benefit of asking that question first, of course, is that there's the mindset that's very prevalent, or a perspective that very much is around, I can't be thinking about the future at the moment, all the visionary stuff. I basically have to try and keep the wheels on the business as it is. So by addressing that up front, we effectively acknowledge that perspective and bring that into the conversation, because it's really important that we do that and sort of ground the visionary thinking going forward. The second question, though, is what would a future system look like? And specifically, and this is the interesting bit, what values and norms would support it? What we're looking for here is, what are the things that are going to guide us? It's really fundamentally important that even with the massive turbulence that we've got right now, we have an understanding of the base values that we are holding true to in our respective businesses and as individuals. So coming together, particularly collectively in a team, to say what is it we're trying to aim for is really quite important. So I've effectively jumped ahead there. I've, as you see, ignored Horizon 2 for the time being, and we'll continue on Horizon 3 as I look at the third question. What example of the future systems exist already today? So what are the things that could provide us a springboard to move forward into that Horizon 3 that we're already seeing? Because we have a sense already there'll be values out there that are being discussed and prescribed and debated, and we may want to sort of hook our chariot to some of those, as it were. Then though, we need to say, well, okay, what innovations could provide the bridge between the two? So we've got this, you know, on the one hand there, the visionary view of the future, but we also, as I said before, got these issues of today. What innovations could provide the growth and the bridging point between the two? And the interesting thing there as well, of course, is to what extent those either try and prolong the current horizon or whether they take us forward into the third. So H2 plus and H2 minus are quite key concepts as well. Am I doing something which essentially is just trying to kick the can down the road of the existing issue that I've got? You could, for example, if I talk in generic terms, if you're talking about the internal combustion engine is a hybrid vehicle, an extension and trying to extending that the internal combustion engine, or is it truly taking us into, say, a future of electric vehicles? But we also have to recognize that not everything changes. So what role will today's current business, current H1 play in the future? So it gives people some kind of way in which we can actually parse some of the ideas of the future and break them apart, as opposed to, right guys, we've got a problem, what are we going to do? So by doing so, you've really really distilled down and given a sort of a sense of how people can think about the future, but thinking of the three futures effectively in the present. What can we do with that? Well, fundamentally, we can, for example, say, what actions can we take now to support the development of H3 capability? Clearly, that is quite an ephemeral thing at the moment, that visionary space, but there'll be maybe potentially some capabilities that we need to build for that emergent future we're trying to go to. What pilot initiatives, particularly those H2 plus ones that are taking forward as opposed to extending where we are, could we undertake today to bridge it from where we are to support that emerging H3 need? And then finally, what current H1 actions, so those things we're currently doing, have the biggest potential to orient us towards the preferred end state? Okay. With that in mind, I mean, those are basically three questions that can sort of get you off the bat straight away. But you can elaborate that into a planning framework, which essentially allows you to define as a group your aspirant future state. What is it we're going to do? Look then down to, well, what are some of the components here which we can develop at the bottom left-hand corner there? So that number two, hope and encouragement from pockets of the future. What are some of the things that we could be considering now, which will actually indicate that that aspirant future state is viable for us? But then look, what are the key things that we need to do to keep the wheels on the business as it is and address the current crisis, as it were? Or hopefully, in other times, probably business as usual. Moving across the same, we then say, well, what are these transformative innovations that now can bridge between the two? And then look at what some of the key aspects of that existing system remain fundamental to the future. So what are the things that we need to keep going? Most importantly as well, of course, and potentially quite significantly in our current environment, is what are those things that we will decommission and stop doing? So we can't take everything from the past to the future, and clearly that future is very different at the moment. So what are some of the things that we need to think about now which potentially either hold us back or need to be shifted forward? Okay, so you can actually pop some stuff in there as well. So it's not all about stuff to be done, but also stuff not to be done in essence. So that's the first of the key tools. And I should say that, and I should have mentioned this before, this is, I'd like to say I invented this tool, but fundamentally I did not. A chap called Bill Sharp did this from the H3 Uni up in Scotland, and it's used quite widely over particularly in the UK. So what we will be doing is be sending some more information out later on in the week, and certainly be some links there to some deeper information if you guys want to explore it further. But of course, one of the things with this is that you're potentially going to have some pretty robust dialogue and tension across this, for example, between H1 ideas and H3 ideas. And so one of the tools I thought I would also include from H3 Uni was this question of dilemma resolution. Now, this is quite tricky, and probably the trickiest of all the tools we're going to talk about this afternoon. You potentially have got two sets of values. The rock value, you could argue, is the basic, we need to make money. We have some really fixed essential values here, and it is really kind of hard. The whirlpool value may be some aspirant value, some place we're trying to go to. So you could almost see this as the sort of the H1 versus the H3, but it doesn't necessarily need to represent those two. Now, the challenge, of course, is that we often think of these in binary terms. So effectively up here, we might see is the top heavy zone represented by the dinosaur, and down here, the lopsided zone, the guys that believe in unicorns. And it's certainly the case that these two often come in conflict. So what we need to try and do is firstly avoid the compromise zone, which is typically where we go, and try and fudge something together. Last time I did this particular exercise, actually, ironically, was on the subject of business travel. And on the one side, the rock value was essentially around, we've got to travel, we've got to see people. And on the other side was the rock value was we have to save money and we have to reduce carbon. So these two seem sort of so opposite in terms of their view, and typically there's a compromise or there's a conflict, and which is not particularly helpful. And what we're trying to do here is move beyond that effectively, and so we're trying to effectively get to a resolution. Now, resolution is effectively to try and bring not so much an either or, but a both and to create those ideas. And what we're really looking for is values. What are the respective values represented by those two things? So by doing so, we could say, for example, the value in that previous example I gave you, the value is we want to connect face to face, we want to make some connection. The other value obviously is we want to reduce travel. But when that conversation kicked off, effectively, it allows people to start thinking about what the positives on both of those are and think through, well, how do we, for example, create better ways of connection without necessarily shifting out onto an aircraft? Ironic that we find ourselves today in very much that position. So yeah, that was a good example of that. This is not something which is absolute. You typically find what we call a dilemma dance as we go from one to the other. And so it's a question of actually managing those values, but certainly looking for the positives as you go forward. Now, before I talk about assumptions, have we got any questions, Barbara?
We do have a question. And
yes.
Both of those tools seem to be really useful currently. Have you ever used them in combination, or do we use one or the other? So what would be the best way of combining them, and is that useful?
Yes, so certainly you can use all of the tools this afternoon can be used effectively in isolation on their own, specifically chosen for that, but can be used in combination too. So I would typically use the dilemma tool where you're actually trying to overcome maybe differences of view as to where you want to be in your vision. Say as a team you have different perspectives, but also whether you have difference of view between this is an H1 perspective and then this is an H3 perspective. Important to make a distinction between them, of course, but it's a useful way to sort of build those kind of common goals.
Some people have asked for practical examples. So if you could give a short practical example, that would be great. What I would also say is that we are planning an online version of a 3 Horizons workshop where we will play through some practical examples. But if you do have a short practical example, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so a number of examples. I've used it a couple of times, both in the tourism industry here, but also, in fact, when I saw Bill Sharp first use it, was the tourism industry in Mallorca, where effectively people are looking to understand what are the current issues of today and what are the aspirant values for the tourism into the future. Now, that can be done at an industry level, but also we've used it as a way of engaging externals. So, for example, we've used it locally with an organization in the fishing industry where they were looking to solicit information from stakeholders as to what they saw as both the current challenges of today. So these are people who weren't working within the organization, but where they would like to see this particular organization move to tomorrow. And also then figuring through, well, what are some of the particular initiatives that could be undertaken, which would be of value to that local community. So it's a very ambidextrous tool, a very versatile tool in that respect, because it can be used at different levels. Obviously, you can use it within the context of your own organization in terms of your own planning processes, but you can also use it as a way of, for example, soliciting information from external stakeholders.
I think I might add to the example of the external stakeholders that we had quite a different range of stakeholders from that one community. So it was some people who were suppliers to the organization, then we had, even the mayor was there, we had a very, very different range of stakeholders, and that also gave quite an interesting dimension to the current values and issues and the future ones.
It engages with different perspectives, certainly.
We do have one other question, then I think we need to move on. When reaching a solution whilst conserving values as well as conserving flexibility, would we not have to compromise at times? We
typically start with compromise, but what we're trying to do here is actually by surfacing values. Typically what we're doing, dare I say it, when we have these kind of dialogues, and we will face this as individuals, we will face this as organizations, and we will face this fundamentally as a nation going forward as well. What we typically try and do is cleave to our respective view, which we see as right. And we don't necessarily look to understand what that other view is and what the value behind it. So that's where you do, yes, typically go, so we'll just, we'll fudge something, we'll come to a compromise. But I think we're all familiar with the compromise concept, which is quite unsatisfactory fundamentally. So this is essentially a role, it's a tool to try and get you to climb beyond that. Starting from that point, it's not suggesting that you can go straight to the top right-hand eagle. As I said before, it's not an easy tool to use, this one, I'll be honest, but I think it's quite an important tool that collectively we probably need to think more about in terms of how we move things forward, because there will certainly be key questions ahead of us, both for organizations and for the nation, which will require us to be somewhat more nuanced in our dialogue. These are basically those are probably quite the two in-depth tools, you might say. These three you can probably do relatively quickly. And the first one is around assumptions, which seems particularly pertinent to the moment because that defines the map in our heads. When we're looking at the moment quite confused as to what the future may hold, this is critical. I mean, you'll see on the right-hand side there, that is an old map of California, which if, for example, I had got that map wrong in the first place, would have got me to do the wrong thing. I'd have probably invested in building boats or something. And reality is that would have been probably unwise. So once that mental model is drawn, though, it's difficult to change. So I guess, again, thinking about where we would be, say, 2 months ago, our assumption would be that it was pretty relatively trivial to jump on an aircraft and go wherever we want. And if somebody even at that stage said, this is probably going to get completely locked down, we would have had difficulty accepting that because our mental models are quite difficult to change. So what can we do about that? Okay, so just around, I'd encourage all of you just to do this now in your own heads, to note a critical assumption for your organization right now. So think something through which you believe to be a key assumption which should hold true for your organization or yourself. Think that through. And then take that assumption, and typically if I was doing this in a workshop setting, I would give this, you would exchange this with a colleague, but you can do this yourselves. Imagine the exact opposite. So you might, for example, have an assumption that air travel will return to something like normality. Then you can obviously flip that around and say it will not return to normality. And then think how that alternative might come true. Now, you will be drawing on some inferences and some information that you have to look at that alternative. Some of it might be relatively tenuous, maybe behavioral change in the case of the air travel piece that means that people aren't going to get on aircraft like they did before, but we don't necessarily have a lot of evidence for that. But if it's a critical assumption for your business and it's highly impactful, then potentially you need to say, where can I get evidence and how do I sort of judge this assumption going forward, okay? And then reflect what that means for your organization. So that's a relatively straight one. And it might seem quite obvious in a way, but I think one of the challenges that we have is that we typically, A, don't surface assumptions, and B, don't surface them collectively. So it's really important with your plans to think, well, what assumptions are we running with as a collective and move it forward, okay? Beyond that, you can use something called an implications wheels to expand your thinking. So this is a good way just to basically say, well, there's a particular change here, and you would do this typically in a group situation or with colleagues. You can do it individually, of course, as well, to say, well, what is the first order consequence of this? So for argument's sake, again, sort of a bit of a COVID one, but you might have the first change might be that we need to open up the borders selectively. And I know that the Germans, for example, are using immunity passports to do that. So if you've got immunity passports, is there an incentive to get one? Or is there a link then to your future passport? So if there's an incentive to get one, will people potentially, the third order, start to deliberately infect themselves so they can get one of those passports? So bit of a quick sort of flick through that one, but you can see how we're going beyond just the first order piece here. We're trying to say, well, what might be a second order piece and what might be a third order piece? Beyond that, it does get highly speculative, so it's not as useful. But this is a good way of saying, well, I've got a particular aspect of my plan here, or we've got an external change occurring. What can I do to anticipate what some of those beyond changes might be? And how can I do that in a systemic context, okay? What can I do with all this information? So fundamentally, the essence of a scenario is a story we're telling ourselves about the future. Now, all of us have stories about the future. Some of our stories have just got blown out the window, but everyone still has some form of view as to what they think is going to happen. So every forecast requires at least one critical assumption. And some of you obviously have identified those for your organizations. Every assumption has an alternative. There's very few of those assumptions that we've got that cannot be challenged in time. Each plausible alternative is the seed for a viable scenario. So you can bring these together, and I'd encourage you to do this. When we talk about scenarios, often people will tend to think of a big exercise where people are writing, sort of doing lots and lots of analysis and coming up, with various ways of generating scenarios. This is the simplest, and it's one that you potentially can do relatively easily. And I guess to demonstrate that, I just did this with COVID the other day. I spent the last week doing COVID analysis, so partly it was probably relatively easy for me, but anyway. So I looked at this in terms of, well, what the economic outcome might be. So that will be one axis. I'm a bit uncertain about that. It's highly impactful. And what might be the response effectiveness? It's quite key to make sure these things are not necessarily very well connected, okay? And on this end, we've probably got variable national responses and ongoing population vulnerability. And the other end, you might say collective eradication in time and widespread vaccination availability as well. So you've got two sort of polar opposites there. On the right-hand side, obviously, we would hope it's probably a little bit more positive. And then in economic terms, we've potentially got a short recession, which might transfer more economic thinking. At the bottom, though, we might have a sustained depression with emphasis on austerity, okay? So what have we got? Well, on the top right-hand there, we've got probably what you might term whistling past the graveyard. An analysis which sort of says, well, we've got some new innovative economic thinking occurring now. We've pretty much dodged the bullet. Unfortunately, not all has dodged the bullet, but in terms of the health side of things. Down at the bottom, you might say, well, let's keep calm and take your meds. It's a bit of a grinding kind of scenario that. The health issue's probably been addressed, but sustained depression with an emphasis on going back to austerity. Think, I guess, Cameron's response after the GFC in the UK, when possibly we said, well, all this helicopter money is not going to do the job. We've basically got to suck it up and tighten our belts. Well, that could be that one was there. This one on the bottom left-hand corner, you'd say was basically with the health issues not looking so flash, and we've also got depression effectively. That's a drop, cover and hold one. Okay, so that's probably the nightmare scenario. And up here, I've got pinball wizard. Why is that? Because effectively you've got different variable responses in terms of the health side of things. You say you might, for example, export markets might be opening and closing. But at the top as well, you've got transformed economic thinking. So I'm quite agile in terms of my thinking there. And I'm getting possibly battered around now and again as well. Okay. So finally, key scenario values that. What would your objective be in each of those? So if you can think of knocking together some scenarios from where you currently sit, you can say, well, is my objective the same? No. Okay, well, what are the actions that I might want to be thinking in each one of those scenarios? And in doing so, it enables you to develop the most resilient strategy, because if you can, A, get some indicators to where scenario you think you're heading to, but also some indicators to say, well, this is the scenario I don't want to go to, but I can see it's occurring. And thinking ahead in action terms, you can make your strategy more resilient and potentially come up with action plans which work best in the most scenarios, okay? So that's really the value of scenario thinking, and I guess proving that it doesn't need to be a very long exercise in that respect. So yes, are there any other questions that you want me just to handle now, Barbara?
Well, there is one. These approaches and tools are great. They're quite different to the approaches of people like Phil Tate and Regenerative, which focus on regenerative design. If you're familiar with those, Phil, could you suggest how they can be reconciled, or do they have different focuses?
One of the things that if you think about the three horizons piece, if you're thinking about regenerative thinking, you're saying, well, how can I create life in this situation? What is it that we can do effectively to build that value into our subsequent business? I mean, I think in many respects, it highlights many of the dimensions of value that we possibly allied to or overlook in many occasions as well. It also, I suppose, means that you can actually understand how you can best take advantage of certain developments as well and not be surprised. One of the things here as well is really just trying to sort of take a step back and not react, but think through how you can actually act in a more regenerative focus going forward by understanding how you can apply those values to particular scenarios as they eventuate.
Thank you, Phil. What we will do is we will have a short description of all these tools up on our website shortly. So if you feel those tools could help you with your thinking through the current times, then do reach out, because we're here to help with this. We also are planning to run, as I said before, an online workshop around the three horizons tool specifically. If you have colleagues who you think want to dial in, we're planning a second session of this webinar on Monday, the 6th of April. We also have a few other webinars up in our pipeline, something around EPDs, a bit more on carbon, specifically on insetting, product stewardship with Juhi from Vector. And I do hope that I will see you soon at some of our webinars. Do get back to us with more questions if you have any. And thanks again to Phil for sharing all those tools with us. We'll follow up and we'll point you to a site where you can find more information. And
thank you, guys.
Thanks again, Phil. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you all again next time. Have a good day. Bye-bye.